You know, the Pharisees and Sadducees were uncompromising enemies. They agreed on almost nothing. Think Congress if you want to figure that one out. But there was one exception here. They reached across the aisle in bipartisan cooperation on one thing. That was a determination to get rid of Jesus. And that's about the only thing they ever agreed on. You get a snapshot of that in Matthew chapter 22. And I'm not going to read these, but just give you an overall survey. First of all, the Pharisees went after Jesus, and you can read that in verses 15 through 22. And they did that by questioning him about paying taxes to Caesar. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? That seems like a question he can't answer without getting in trouble. If he says pay taxes to Caesar, he's in trouble with the Jews. If he says don't pay taxes to Caesar, he's in trouble with Rome. Well, you know the rest of the story and how he put that entrapment to rest. And then the Sadducees came at him, and they came at him concerning a law which was called the levirate marriage. Levirate marriage was simply the fact that if a man married a woman and he died before fathering a child with her, if he had an unmarried brother, that brother was obligated to marry that widow and father a child in the name of that first brother. And that way he would maintain his reputation, but not only that, he would maintain his name and he would maintain his property in that family name. So these Sadducees who did not believe in resurrection, the Pharisees did, the Sadducees didn't. They didn't believe that there was anything after this life. And so they came at him with a question regarding this levirate marriage. They said, we had 7 brothers in our town. One of those brothers married a woman, but he died before he fathered a child with her. And so his brother married that widow, but he also died before fathering a child with her. And so did the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th and the 6th and the 7th. All 7 of these brothers married this woman, and none of them fathered a child with her. So their question to him is, since they didn't believe in the resurrection, their question of him is, in the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Since all 7 of them had been married to her. Well, as you know, in that particular story, he told them they were ignorant, that they didn't know the power of God and they didn't know the scriptures. And you know how he put that one to rest. So the Pharisees came after him again. And this one is going to be in verses 34 through 36. They came and had another shot at it. Hearing that he had put the Sadducees to silence, which would, under any other circumstance, have pleased them mightily. Hearing that he had put them to silence, they recruited a lawyer, an expert in the law, to come and question him. And his question to Jesus was this: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? How do you answer that? They had come up with 613 different laws. Which is the greatest of all of these 613 laws? The rabbis who were devoted to hair splitting constantly debated these commandments, all of them, arguing whether a particular commandment was great or small, whether it was heavy or whether it was light. I suppose that the command not to murder would be a bit heavier, probably, than the command that prohibited boiling a kid goat in his mother's milk. And so they were asking him to single it down and say which is the greatest commandment in all of the law. That would sink him. Whichever one he prioritized, he was going to cause division because they simply could not agree. He's going to offend somebody. Check out the letters to the editor tomorrow. They cannot agree, and they're not going to agree here. It was almost certain that whatever he said was going to be divisive. But Jesus immediately quoted the one commandment that was most familiar to them, because it was the one commandment that they recited at the beginning of every synagogue service. It was the one commandment that they recited every morning when they first got out of bed and every evening when they got ready to go to bed. It was the first commandment that was ever memorized by Jewish children. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. It was the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and there it says, with all your strength. And Jesus said, this is the first and greatest commandment, but without taking a breath, he said, there's a second one like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. This expert in the law had asked him for the one supreme command. And Jesus said it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And then he added a second, love your neighbor as yourself. That one was from Leviticus 19. And there's a whole list of things in Leviticus 19 that define what that love for your neighbor is. But God wants us to see people as he sees them. In fact, love for God means seeing other people as God sees them. And God has love for every human being. Now, in Luke chapter 10, we come across this Shema again, but it's a totally different setting. Sounds a little bit like the same because we have a lawyer that's involved in it again, but this is a different setting. And the Shema here is quoted by somebody else. It's not quoted by Jesus here. It's quoted by this expert in the law. And the text says that he was an expert in the law. And he came to Jesus with this question, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you've been studying the law all your life. You know the law as well as I do. And so, how do you read the law? And he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, you got it. Do that, and you'll live. But the text says that he wanted to justify himself, and so he wasn't quite through. He wanted definition. Yes, this is right. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. But his question is, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Who qualifies as my neighbor? Who deserves that kind of love and that kind of help from me? And so Jesus told a story. It's a story that you know well. One of his best known parables pointed to a road that went from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it was a treacherous stretch of road. Sometimes it was called the Bloody Pass. And he said a man was traveling on that road and he got mugged. And he said the robbers took everything that he had. They stripped him, they beat him, they left him half dead. And one point that needs to be seen clearly here is we don't know anything about that man, not a thing. We don't know his name. We don't know his occupation. We don't know his nationality. We've always assumed that he was a Jew, and that's probably safe. But it doesn't say that he was, so we don't really even know his religion. We're told nothing about him that makes him either desirable or undesirable. He's just in that story as a generic human being. Jesus said some professional people came by there, professional religionists. The first one was a priest, and perhaps he was headed to Jerusalem to perform his duty as a clergyman. He would only get to do that a couple of times a year, so he wouldn't want to miss that rotation. But if this man was dead, this priest couldn't afford to be anywhere close to him, because if he had been close to him, he would have been declared unclean for 7 days, and he couldn't perform his priestly duty. Now, I don't know if that was the case or not, but for whatever reason, he moved to the other side of the road and he passed by. And then Jesus said a Levite came by. All priests were Levites. Not all Levites were priests, but still he was a professional religionist. And for whatever reason, he too passed by on the other side. And then a third man came by, and he was a Samaritan. A Samaritan. The last person that you would expect to stop and help. He was an outsider, hated by the Jews, considered to be a half-breed, half Jew, half Gentile. There is no indication whatever that he had any particular affection for this injured man, but he stopped and he helped. He had some wine. He had some oil. Those were considered medications. He had some material that he could use for bandaging. He had a donkey. He had a few coins in his pocket. He fixed this man up as well as he possibly could. Put him on his donkey, took him to an inn, took care of him through the night. And then the next morning, when he was leaving to continue his journey, he gave the innkeeper some money, and he said, I want you to take care of this injured man and run a tab. And if I haven't given you enough to take care of him like he needs to be taken care of, you keep that tab and you let me know, and when I come back through, I'll make up the difference. Jesus asked the expert in the law, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The lawyer said, well, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus said, that's right, and you need to go and do likewise. Jesus is doing something here that defines love. He is removing love from a place of feeling to a place of action, from a place of feeling something to a place of doing something. And the radical thing that he does is that he redefines who the neighbor is. The lawyer asked, who is my neighbor? Jesus flipped the question. He said, which of these three, priest, Levite, Samaritan, which of these three proved to be a neighbor to the injured man? The neighbor, in other words, is not the person who needs the help. It's the person who's doing the helping. And if you come to that story with your eyes wide open and you say, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus is going to say to you, it's the wrong question. It's the wrong question. The question is, to whom are you a neighbor? And what kind of a neighbor are you? Which of these three proved to be neighbor to a man? He changed the question from who is the object of the help to who is doing the helping. He wants to know, what kind of a neighbor are you? Who is my neighbor? That doesn't depend on him. It depends on you. Now, here's where we need to go with this. We have some trouble coming to terms when Jesus says, "Love your enemies," and when he talks about loving your neighbor as yourself. How in the world can you pull that off? How can you pull that off? And it brings us to the point where we have to have a look at what love really means. And the bottom line is that love is not something you feel. That's the way we define love. Love is not something you feel. Love is something you do, according to this story. Jesus didn't say, like your enemy. You are not going to like your enemy. You can't like your enemy. He said, love your enemy. And you can love your enemy according to the way that he said to do it. In the Sermon on the Plain, Jesus said, love your enemies, and then he showed that love is something you do. Love your enemies, and that was followed by three things that define what that means. Number one, do good to those who mistreat you. Number two, bless, ask God to bless those who curse you. Number three, pray for those who mistreat you. Not that those things are easy, but they are things that can be done. So it's a matter of making the action precede the feeling, not demanding that you have to feel it before you can do it. Matthew chapter 25, where Jesus is talking about the judgment scene, and he says, I was hungry and thirsty and sick and without clothes, and you said, I'm sorry, and you will be in my thoughts and prayers. No. No. He said, you gave me food and drink and clothes. It wasn't something you felt, it was something that you did. We forever run the risk of being well-wishers instead of well-doers. It's so easy to put thought in the place of doing instead of doing good things. Jesus' definition of love is that you pour in the oil and the wine and you bandage that person and you put him on your donkey and you take him to an inn and you take care of him. That is his definition of love. Love is something you do. It's something that I can make happen. I can initiate it. I don't have to wait until I have a feeling for somebody before I do something for somebody. Harold Hazlett told me about a colleague of his who was a marriage counselor. He told about a lady who came to see him. She'd been married for 8 years. And she said, my husband and I have absolutely nothing in common. Nothing. We're going in totally opposite directions constantly. I love the arts. He loves sports. I love to travel. He loves the couch and TV. We don't agree on anything. We come out on opposite ends of anything we discuss. It makes no difference what it is. And I see no hope for our marriage. The only thing that I can see in our marriage is divorce. I see nothing else. What do you say to a person like that? What do you do in a case like that? Well, what this man did was he said to this lady, before you throw in the towel, before you call it quits, I wish you'd do one thing. For 30 days, I'd like for you to think about what your husband likes and what he doesn't like. You've been with him long enough to know what he likes, what he doesn't like. And for 30 years, I'd like for you to do those things that he likes, those things that will please him, not to manipulate him, not to control him, not to get your way at the end of this thing, but just to bring some happiness and joy into his life. Try it for 30 days and see if there's any hope at the end of that time. Well, she left without any promise of commitment to his counsel. She gave no indication of what she would do. But sometime after that 30 days was passed, she walked back into his office and she was quite a different person. She said, when I came to see you, I had so many bad feelings. It had been so long since I had even cared about what he liked or what he disliked. And I was unable to work through all of those negative feelings. But I did finally decide to try your suggestion. And I began doing the things that he liked, the things that I thought would please him. And after a few days, he looked at me and he said, "What's going on? What's happened to you? You're a different person." And so she said, I told him what I was doing, told him what you had suggested, and that I was following the suggestion. And he didn't say a word. But he started doing things that I liked and things that would please me. And she said, you know, during these last days, something incredible has happened. We have both begun to enjoy doing what pleases the other. We still have issues, but we have something to work with. Love is something you do. I don't know how that story played out, but I have a feeling. A lot of times feelings will flow out of the action. In fact, I think usually they will. But they don't have to precede the action. What God most wants from us is for us to love him with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. That sounds easy, but it's not so easy. When bad things happen, we don't know exactly how to deal with that, but sometimes God gets the blame. Why does he let it happen? And so sometimes we have some rather bad feelings about that. Why is it so difficult for us to feel close to God sometimes? You know, H.G. Wells was one of the most prominent unbelievers of the 20th century, and in the last book that he wrote, that was in the 1920s, so it's been a century ago, was called Mind at the End of Its Tether. He labeled God in that book the antagonist. The antagonist. He saw God as setting himself up against man To see God as the antagonist is the ultimate distortion because he so loved the world, he did something while we were enemies, sinners. He did something. He gave his son. He gave his son. Love is something you do. And God exhibited his love for us, first of all, in something he did. How can you develop this love for God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength? I wonder what would happen if you tried for 30 days doing what you know he wants you to do, and just with every conscious moment before you do something and before you say something, you ask, is it something that will please him? Will it please him? And then follow that. I'm guessing that the feeling of love will follow, but it doesn't have to precede it. We might find ourselves not just saying, but actually feeling that we love God with all our heart and soul and mind and strength. Would you try it for 30 days? Will you? Will you? Let's pray.